In the late 8th century, those destined to conquer the world burst forth from the icy northern seas. For the next 3 centuries, they unleashed their might upon civilized nations, unopposed. Neither boundless oceans, the terror of the unknown, nor Europe's powerful rulers could halt their swift advance. They were the Vikings, and behind the veil of their barbaric legend lies a reality even more astonishing. These brave explorers, tireless settlers, and enterprising traders crossed the seas in search of both war spoils and legitimate wealth. From the rugged shores of North America to the bustling markets of Baghdad, they pushed the boundaries of the known world, instigating remarkable social, political, and economic changes. But then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. Around 1,200 years ago, the Vikings burst forth from the cold North Sea, like wild beasts unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. They came from lands of deep fjords, meager farms, and fierce clan feuds, places now known as Scandinavia. They left behind legends of their ferocity and fearlessness, sagas of great explorations and conquests, and something even more astonishing, buried deep beneath the earth of their Scandinavian homeland. In 1880, Norwegian archaeologists made an extraordinary discovery in Norway that opened a window into the past, revealing for the first time a true picture of how the Vikings lived and died. It was a revelation, astounding in its unexpectedness. It completely changed the perception of Vikings, from the image of a raiding northern culture, supposedly wearing horned helmets and descending upon Europe with swords. They transformed into a people with a civilization as complex and artistic as any other in Europe at the time. One artifact, discovered in several burial sites across Scandinavia, reveals more about the Scandinavian Vikings than any other find. It is a ship, a burial ship, interred as a tomb and filled with items believed to be needed by its owner for the journey to the afterlife. In that era, the only way to travel by water was by boat, and the Vikings created truly remarkable vessels. When archaeologists first began excavations, they could hardly believe that such elegant ships could actually venture into the open sea. However, they proved to be remarkably seaworthy, extremely maneuverable, and, with a draft of only about 3 inches, could easily navigate up rivers. One of the notable Viking traditions was the burial of their great figures in ships with all their possessions, as they believed the deceased were embarking on a long journey. All items that might be needed for life and eternity were placed on the ship, which was then meticulously buried, ensuring their excellent preservation to this day. Who were these enigmatic barbarians with such elaborate burial rites? What compelled them to become the scourge of the Dark Ages? The setting is the late 700s, the highlands of Norway. We have some information about what life was like before the Vikings began their sea voyages and raids. They were generally a settled, predominantly agricultural people, largely organized around villages or their clans, likely along family lines, though we cannot be entirely certain of this. They had chieftains who governed these small groups, sometimes warring among themselves. But Viking life was largely a struggle for survival. The climate was colder than in the rest of Europe, and the weather could at times be harsh. Survival was likely extremely difficult, and this is an important aspect of understanding their subsequent actions. At the dawn of the Viking Age, the family farm was the primary economic unit of Scandinavian life. As farmers and herders, they planted grains and vegetables in short growing seasons and relied heavily on their livestock. However, peace in the northern lands was coming to an end. The growing Viking population increased the demand for fertile land. Tensions mounted, and violence inevitably erupted between Viking clans as the strong preyed on the weak. Raiders descended upon farmers with axes and swords, employing brutal violence. Land feuds erupted, accompanied by complete lawlessness. Essentially, a king was a man who had a large farm, and he had his bondsmen, his farmers, and his slaves. And whenever he wanted to attack someone else, he simply gathered all his men and went on the offensive. The Vikings would burst into a village, grab whatever they could, and vanish again. It wasn't particularly sophisticated, but it was extremely effective. Since land and wealth were scarce in the northern lands, some Vikings set aside their differences and prepared to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Hands and tools, once carving barn beams, were now occupied with an entirely different task. Along the shores of the northern inlets, something was taking shape, something that would change the lives of these people forever: the Viking longship. These extraordinary vessels, revolutionary in their design, steered history onto an entirely new course and initiated an offensive that would dominate Europe and beyond for the next 3 centuries. In their longships, the Vikings employed centuries-old shipbuilding techniques and seafaring skills. The Vikings, as we know them, would not have existed without the Viking ship. And it was the evolution of this technology that allowed them to leave such a significant mark on history. Over time, they learned to build vessels seaworthy enough to cross even the North Atlantic. This truly gave the Vikings their unprecedented long-range reach. Such a ship could be assembled, perhaps, in a month or 6 weeks, and its design was always exactly the same. They would make a vessel either as wide as needed for calm waters or as deep as required for the open ocean. And if they needed a ship to travel up the rivers of Russia or Europe, a raiding vessel that could penetrate into the very heart of the continent, they could use the same style, the same building technique, but simply a scaled-down version. They were light enough to be carried over portages, dragged up rivers, and could be sailed, which was one of their important features, because the boats were lightning fast and nothing could catch them. This was no longer a coastal vessel, like many Mediterranean ones. They made crossings from Norway to Scotland, from the Faroe Islands to Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland across open waters that were too dangerous for coastal vessels. And the Vikings were not afraid of this. They had the technology to make it happen. The result was a vessel with a shallow draft and high adaptability, a true technological marvel of its time. This people was not governed by a single king or a centralized government. Each Scandinavian village functioned autonomously, proclaiming its own ruler. The Vikings united to accomplish their audacious objectives, leaving families in their homelands and embarking on sea voyages for plunder. Accordingly, their equipment was meticulously prepared. Among the first to fall victim to their raids were the monks of Lindisfarne on the English coast in June 793. The monastery of St. Cuthbert on the island of Lindisfarne was one of the most sacred sites in the British Isles, rich in both spiritual and material treasures. As the monks rang their bells, heading for morning service, these dragons suddenly emerged from the waters. The Vikings descended upon them with the force of a storm, ruthlessly destroying, carrying off all valuables, and setting the abbey ablaze. The monks often described this attack as an invasion by hellish demons. The Vikings, without a doubt, were skilled warriors. Their existence was based on the use of intimidation, fear, and terror. They acted as ruthless raiders and disciplined soldiers. They were characterized by exceptional ferocity, greed, and a high degree of skill. While we tend to perceive these people as barbarians, in reality, their battle order and strict discipline in achieving their goals were highly militarized. A Viking warrior represented a highly effective fighting unit, a large, muscular Scandinavian, often clad in leather armor. Each was armed with simple but deadly tools, a knife, a sword, and a battle axe. The battle axe was reportedly considered the most formidable weapon in their arsenal, as Vikings demonstrated incredible skill in throwing these axes, capable of decapitating or completely incapacitating an opponent. Coastal monasteries particularly attracted the Vikings due to the wealth accumulated within them and the monks' apparent passivity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the compilation of which began in the late 8th century, serves as a key historical source for studying England from the 5th to the 11th centuries. It vividly describes the terror spawned by the Viking invaders. It states, in particular, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. Historical records note this sacrilegious attack on the monks and their treasures in 793 as a significant milestone, the first large-scale Viking sea raid. However, Lindisfarne and other vulnerable monasteries along the coast of the British Isles were merely a prelude. As the 8th century drew to a close, Viking raiders set their sights on more significant targets. Major European cities would soon experience the might and fury of these Northmen, as well as the deep bite of their steel. The Vikings left Scandinavia with a singular purpose: plunder. The attack on Lindisfarne in northern England in 793 ignited the flame of Viking barbarism that threatened to engulf the entire European continent. By the mid-9th century, just about 50 years after the events at Lindisfarne, news of Europe's immense wealth had already spread far and wide. Scandinavian families, entire villages, and communities joined forces to build longships. Their intention was to improve their own standing at the expense of unsuspecting peoples across the sea. While the Spanish later sought gold upon arriving in America, the Vikings sought silver, which for them represented the greatest value. Many religious artifacts, crosses, and other items found in monasteries were indeed made of silver. Viking bands embarked on overseas expeditions without a single ruler coordinating their actions. Their flotillas sometimes grew to dozens of vessels. Each fleet continued to operate autonomously, which significantly hindered resistance to their attacks. As the reputation of individual Viking leaders grew, so did their ambitions. Europe became their invaluable prey. The European continent possesses a unique geography, being crisscrossed by numerous navigable rivers, unlike North America or Africa, where such rivers are few. In Europe, their abundance allowed the Vikings to use virtually any large body of water for their vessels, considering that their ships were narrow and long, requiring little depth for navigation. One of the first large-scale river attacks occurred in 845 under the command of the infamous Viking chieftain named Ragnar. With a fleet of 120 ships, he descended upon Paris with redoubled force, using the same route as in previous campaigns. Even before they reached the city, Ragnar's Vikings annihilated French advance parties on the banks of the Seine, dooming their French captives to a terrible fate. In essence, they acted as terrorists, actively relying on terror to facilitate their objectives. They sought to minimize effort, so they tried to be as terrifying as possible. There is even a story of a Viking nicknamed the Children's Lover, because he didn't toss infants into the air and impale them with his sword as they fell. In other words, these were very unpleasant people. It is said that on that day, Ragnar's Vikings hanged 111 captured soldiers. A local monk named Herman Terrace describes the Viking invasion and the destruction that continued for decades along the Seine and other rivers, spreading ever further. The number of ships constantly increased, and he wrote, "The endless stream of Vikings never ceases to grow. Everywhere, Christians are victims of massacres, arsons, and looting. The Vikings conquer everything in their path, and nothing can stand against them." Events unfold as an imposing Viking fleet, gliding along the waters of the Seine, approaches Paris, a city renowned for its powerful fortifications. The French monarch, Charles the Bald, instead of engaging in open confrontation and risking the destruction of his capital, decided to pay them off. He paid the Viking chieftain Ragnar a substantial sum, nearly 6 tons of silver and gold. The king hoped this would make the invaders leave forever. However, the consequences proved to be the exact opposite. News of easy plunder and tribute quickly spread, confirming the availability of land and wealth. As a result, the looting of northern Europe and the continent resumed with renewed vigor. Between 790 and 1100, the Vikings penetrated deep into the continent along all major rivers and waterways, opening new horizons for themselves. Norwegians, in particular, wrote one of the most vivid chapters in Viking history, proving themselves fearless explorers who colonized Iceland, Greenland, and other lands. The colonization of Greenland is closely associated with the names of 2 legendary Norwegian Vikings, Eric the Red and his son, Leif Erikson. In the late 990s, Eric led an expedition, becoming the first to begin colonizing this harsh territory. Being a hot-tempered man, Eric was soon exiled from Iceland for 3 years. He headed west and settled on the eastern coast of Greenland. To attract settlers, he actively began advertising these lands. However, without mentioning that only a small coastal strip was habitable, he proclaimed the existence of a vast Greenland. Some undoubtedly came to see the conditions for themselves and returned, but many strong, resilient, and enduring Vikings stayed, facing an extremely harsh life. The land was not well suited for agriculture, but fish and game provided sustenance, despite the overall inhospitable nature of the area. During Eric the Red's rule, Norwegian agrarian society struggled greatly to survive in this distant land. To manage their affairs, the inhabitants convened the Althing, a type of public assembly or court inherited from their homelands. At these assemblies, free people had the right to speak in their own defense and on matters concerning the entire community. It was from this community of free people that Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, emerged. Like his father, he felt an irresistible urge to explore. In 1000 he set sail. Leif Erikson followed rumors of another Viking who, before him, had left a record of sailing west to reach another colony in Greenland, but was blown off course, and when he found his bearings, he found himself off the coast of a very green and lush land. Greenland, however, was neither green nor lush. Following these rumors of an unknown land to the west, Leif Erikson made the discovery of the New World. This event is fascinating but still generates much debate. Many researchers, including the author of this narrative, are convinced that America was discovered by the Vikings around the year 1000. For instance, radiocarbon dating of Leif Erikson's settlement in Newfoundland precisely dated it to 1000 AD. Thus, it is established that the Vikings at least reached Newfoundland and likely advanced further south. The Greenlanders' attempt to establish a permanent settlement here was unsuccessful. It is estimated that the colony in Newfoundland lasted only about 10 years, and yet, 500 years before Columbus embarked on his epic voyage, the Vikings had already connected the eastern and western hemispheres. After wintering in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland. He introduced something new to the island's settlers. Using the same tools that built the famous longships, they began erecting the crude crosses of a new religion. The settlers decided to convert to Christianity. Leif Erikson, who had previously traveled to Norway, received a special commission from the king to bring Christianity to Greenland and Christianize the Greenlandic colonies, which he faithfully carried out. As Viking influence expanded, the surrounding world began to exert a formative impact on the Vikings themselves. Their leaders saw Christianity as a means to unite their people and, ultimately, to strengthen control over them. At the dawn of the 11th century, 200 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, the Norwegian people still lacked a single king and a sense of solidarity. Christianity offered a reason for unification. However, Christian Vikings sometimes faced resistance from their pagan kinsmen, who were unwilling to abandon their ancient gods. Kings began converting to Christianity because it helped them consolidate power, and they started imposing it on these people. And there was much struggle. People didn't like it. They didn't want to give up their old customs. They were afraid to give up their old customs. There were some Christian missionaries who came to the island and converted a few, but there were many skeptics. And at one point, they decided to conduct a test against the pagan deities and their representative, known as a berserker, a man who was, to put it mildly, a bit mad. So, these Christian missionaries challenged them. We will light a fire, and you pagans, light a fire. If the berserker can walk through your fire but cannot walk through ours, then we know Christianity has won. If he cannot walk through yours, then we know paganism has won. It's almost like an Old Testament duel. Snorri reports that the Viking berserker easily walked through the fire lit by the pagans but could not pass through the flames kindled by the Christians. Thus, all present were convinced of the truth of the Christian faith. Meanwhile, across the lands of Norway, one was preparing to emerge who would become a great catalyst for uniting the scattered Viking clans. Fate brought him together with the young Harald Hardrada, half-brother and rightful heir to the Norwegian King Olaf. He was barely 15 when he found himself on the losing side of a bloody Viking civil war. However, Harald, against all odds, was determined to return to exact his revenge and write his own history, drenching it in the blood of vanquished foes. In those times, the Vikings spread across European lands like a deadly plague. Defenseless monasteries were their first victims, but soon the invaders brought their terror even deeper into the continent. Ultimately, the Vikings turned against each other. By 1030, Norway was engulfed in the flames of civil war. At the Battle of Stiklestad, forces loyal to the Danish ruler Knut the Great clashed with the troops of the Norwegian King Olaf. From the ashes of these internecine conflicts that stained Norwegian soil and soul, a young warrior arose, Harald Hardrada, half-brother and heir to King Olaf. In the mid-11th century, as Harald reached maturity, an ambition was born within him to lead and unite Norway, but for this, he first needed to acquire the necessary power. Harald was, undoubtedly, a truly remarkable individual. He began his, if you will, Viking regime in his youth. At the age of 16, he was wounded in a battle that ultimately claimed the life of his royal brother and was forced to flee. Harald Hardrada went into exile in distant northern lands. His path led first to Sweden, and then to Kiev, a thriving trading city located in modern-day Ukraine. In 1031, he followed the route of the Swedish Vikings, who for the previous 2 centuries had established trading centers to access exotic eastern goods. The Swedes, initially arriving as brutal raiders, stayed to transform into cosmopolitan traders. Through trade, Kiev connected the Scandinavian world with the broader world of the East, a moment not lost on Harald. When archaeologists find coin hoards from this period, they discover coins from all over the world among them, and in the ruins of Hedeby, for example, even small Buddha figurines have been found. It was these connections between peoples that proved far more significant than simply destroying everything in their path. It was at this intersection of culture and commerce that Harald realized that without a market for his spoils, his power would be limited. This was a lesson he would soon put into practice. The Vikings lived by trade for hundreds of years. When a warrior plundered a monastery, seizing a pile of chalices and manuscripts, he certainly didn't take them home. What use were they? He needed to go somewhere and exchange them for what he truly wanted. But material goods were only one part of trade. The Vikings were also traders in human flesh, slave traders. They traded men and women captured by their raiding parties. Women in those days died at a horrifying rate during childbirth, so there was a constant need to replenish the supply of women. They would seize girls, take them away, and, undoubtedly, rape them, then take them to slave pens and sell them. However, despite the valuable economic lessons learned in Kiev, Harold did not come there solely to seek his fortune in the market. The heart of a Viking beat strongly within him. He also had to embrace the mantle of a warrior and master the skills that would make him king. By 1038, Harold had become self-assured and eager for plunder. He now led an elite unit of Viking mercenaries. He fought insurrections on behalf of foreign rulers across the east, accumulating wealth and power, preparing to return to Norway and seize the crown. It was in Sicily that Harold demonstrated his legendary ingenuity. Harold's generalship was characterized not so much by great bravery as by great cunning, which was a chief Viking virtue. Rather than simply hitting people over the head, if they could be cunning, they preferred that. One of his tactics was as follows. When they approached a city and besieged it, Harold ordered his men to catch small birds that flew into and out of the city. Then, using resin and thread, they attached small burning twigs to the birds' backs and released them. The birds flew back into the city to their nests and thatched roofs and immediately set the city ablaze. This is how they took the city. In Harold's saga, the 13th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson writes about the effectiveness of this plan in the conquest of Sicily. Then all the inhabitants came out of the city, begging for mercy, he writes. The very people who had for days been shouting defiant insults at the army and its leader. Harold spared the lives of all who sought mercy and took full control of the city. After nearly 15 years, the cunning Harold had amassed the reputation and wealth he needed to finally legitimately claim his fragmented homeland. In 1046, he returned to Scandinavia, a renowned mercenary with the wealth and ambition of a king, but without the title. As next in line for the Norwegian throne, he was now ready to assert his claims. The problem was that his nephew was on the throne at the time. Harold, being a rather politically astute man, naturally struck a deal with his nephew for co-rule. This plan worked. The nephew died a year later. There is no evidence that Harold killed him, although such accusations were certainly leveled against him. Harold did not deny them. And ultimately, Harold once again led Norway. Having asserted his claims to the royal crown, Harald Hardrada proceeded to methodically consolidate his position, ruthlessly eliminating all who dared to challenge him. From 1047, the year of his ascension to the Norwegian throne, he launched a full-scale campaign to eradicate opposition, employing an inhumane combination of tactical cunning and relentless thirst for retribution. Harold unleashed a truly ferocious rage upon all his adversaries. After many years of persistent power building, in 1047, Harald Hardrada was crowned ruler of Norway. His reign over the warlike Viking people was based on pure, unadulterated force. Harold's loyal warriors, known for their ruthlessness, systematically ravaged the farms and villages of those who dared to oppose the new monarch. Their harsh message echoed across the lands, leaving no room for interpretation, submit, or die. Throughout the land, Harald Hardrada's enemies paid the ultimate price for their disloyalty, losing not only their possessions but also their lives. His philosophy of power, rooted in intimidation, was vividly expressed in his own words, recorded in the famous Saga of Harald Hardrada, "I kill without remorse and remember all my killings. Treachery must be suppressed by any means before it consumes me. Oaks of rebellion grow from acorns of betrayal." After the flames of rebellion were mercilessly extinguished, a period of triumph and reward ensued. In King Harald Hardrada's vast longhouse, his loyal supporters gathered to celebrate the victory with a lavish and abundant feast. In Viking society, possessing significant wealth, especially in the form of gold, was a direct path to high esteem and influence. Such a leader could generously reward his followers, thereby strengthening their loyalty. This ability to provide material incentives served as the foundation for forming and maintaining powerful armies. Chieftains had to not only provide their warriors with food, but also regularly shower them with precious metal, satisfying their desire for wealth and recognition. Gifts could range from intricately crafted gold rings, bestowed for outstanding deeds, to luxurious gold cups, symbolizing status in the chieftain's favor. Thus, the accumulation of vast amounts of treasure became not just a desire but a strategic necessity, which was one of the main driving forces for King Harald Hardrada, whose palace raids and military campaigns were aimed at continuously replenishing his treasury with gold. A true Viking lord, beyond his wealth, had to possess exceptional strength of spirit and a charismatic personality capable of attracting people. His reputation as an invincible warrior, capable of leading his people to glorious victories and protecting them from destruction, was the cornerstone of his authority. This is why people flocked to these spacious halls, where grand feasts were held, gold was generously distributed, and mead flowed freely. And while these gatherings often concluded with swords being drawn and setting off on another expedition to kill someone, they also served other purposes. Primarily, the magnificent Viking Hall served as the epicenter of all Viking life, its heart and soul. Within these walls, crucial political agreements were struck, financial transactions conducted, and strategic alliances formed. The Viking system of power itself was remarkably adaptive and flexible, allowing them to react instantly to any changes and reorganize. If a chieftain fell, whether in battle, due to humiliation, or for another reason, his place was immediately taken by another, often from entirely unexpected circles. Drawing inspiration from the prosperous city of Kiev, Harald Hardrada harbored an ambitious plan. His goal was to establish a major trading hub in a strategically important coastal city, capable of receiving goods from all corners of the then-known world. This city became Oslo, destined to become one of Northern Europe's most vital ports. Harald keenly understood that the development of trade could unite the scattered Viking tribes and provide them with much-desired wealth and stability. Oslo's marketplaces soon filled with a variety of goods from Viking farms, from fresh wheat and vegetables to valuable furs and sturdy fabrics. Meanwhile, swift Viking longships traversed the seas, bringing exotic goods to Oslo from all known lands. Aromatic spices, precious gold, exquisite textiles, glittering gems, and even slaves. One could find elegant pottery and glass from Germanic lands, refined silver jewelry from Francia, and even dirhams minted in distant Arab caliphates. As Oslo grew and prospered, the Viking people gradually transformed into skilled and shrewd traders. The daily life of this thriving trading community was vividly reflected in artifacts found in burials, gold items, richly inlaid weapons, elegant jewelry, and simple yet functional wooden objects crafted by the Vikings themselves. However, even such extensive development of a trade center only fueled Harald Hardrada's insatiable appetite for even greater wealth and absolute control. Soon, Harald realized that his ambitions demanded a grander objective, and his gaze turned to the rich lands of England. He equipped and led an impressive fleet, comprising numerous longships. Even the rebellious brother of the English monarch joined his expedition, lending legitimacy to Harald's claims. Thus, Harald Hardrada, with unwavering determination, embarked on his great campaign. Gazing upon the shores of England and contemplating the future, Harald, without a doubt, envisioned a grand empire extending to all lands his famous longships could reach. This man, once a mere refugee, had managed to acquire astonishing power and undeniable political influence among his warlike people. He had already managed to subdue even the most stubborn and defiant of his Viking adversaries. His triumphant path had thus far met with only minor resistance. It seemed that England, with all its untold riches, was within easy reach of his iron grip. However, awaiting Harald Hardrada and his army was a powerful and highly disciplined force, a confrontation far more formidable than any he had previously encountered. This was a battle that threatened to turn all his conquests to dust. The end of September 1066 was approaching. A messenger galloped into the city of York, bringing grim and urgent news. Viking King Harald Hardrada himself was inexorably approaching. The English were well aware of his reputation as a ruthless warrior. It was clear that only swift and decisive action, combined with the greatest courage, could halt his advance. Harald began his invasion from the coast, and after a series of swift and bloody skirmishes, his victory in that region seemed almost certain. York itself, it seemed, was ready to capitulate. Harald, leading a portion of his troops, advanced towards Stamford Bridge, located approximately 7 miles from the city. He expected the chieftains of York to arrive, bringing tribute and surrendering hostages as a sign of their submission and payment of ransom. In fact, Harald was so confident that the northern lands of England were already under his control that he brought only a partial contingent of his warriors, ordering them to leave their heavy armor behind. However, the English side showed not the slightest complacency. Their monarch, Harald Godwinson, vigorously marched his military contingents through the forest with the sole purpose of cutting off the Viking army's retreat paths. English swordsmen, clad in chainmail, and archers, superbly armed, were filled with unwavering determination to halt the northern invasion and defend their city. When the English forces appeared before them, the Vikings, according to sagas, were filled with utter astonishment, beholding armor gleaming in the midday sun, relentlessly approaching. Initially, they could not identify the strangers. Only as the distance closed did the truth become apparent. The saga of Harald Hardrada describes this sight as an ice cover, with weapons glinting in the sun's rays. At this critical moment, Harald Hardrada made a fateful decision. Instead of tactically retreating and awaiting the arrival of his remaining forces from the ships, he accepted the challenge and chose to engage immediately. After some time, the English forces executed a tactical retreat. Harald Hardrada, mistakenly interpreting this as a sign of his victory, allowed his troops to break formation. History has preserved the tale of a single brave warrior who single-handedly held the bridge, preventing the entire English army from advancing. This type of fierce, small-scale resistance was not uncommon in the Middle Ages, though large-scale battles were rare. According to the saga of Harald Hardrada, the Viking leader inspired his men with piercing words, "Always hold your head high in battle, where swords seek to shatter the skulls of doomed warriors." The courageous defender of the bridge steadfastly held off the assault, but eventually, when his defense was breached, English soldiers were able to reach Harald. The now unobstructed bridge allowed the English warriors to descend upon the lightly armored Viking forces, cutting through their ranks with ruthless efficiency like a scythe through ripe wheat. The battle raged with furious brutality. The Vikings, displaying all their skill and unyielding bravery, fought against an army defending its homeland. One by one, the warriors of the north fell, their blood soaking the English soil. Viking sagas, recounting this desperate struggle, state, "The brave chieftain's heart did not falter. Mighty kings displayed the greatest courage in the roar of battle. His blood-stained sword wounded the enemy to death. In the midst of the fierce clash, a narrow, fatally accurate arrow, as if guided by fate itself, found its mark, striking Harald Hardrada's throat. The reinforcements Harald had relied upon arrived only towards the end of the day, but their appearance was fatally delayed. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the Viking forces suffered an almost complete defeat. By nightfall, the rout of the Norsemen was absolute and undeniable. Harald Hardrada, who had set foot on English soil in September 1066 with thousands of soldiers and the grandest ambitions of a conqueror, ultimately found only the ruins of his plans and inevitable death. To transport his formidable army from Norway, Harald Hardrada had utilized 270 ships, but only 30 of them returned. In the following decades, Vikings continued to conduct sporadic raids, yet none of these ventures reached such significant scales or approached the heart of the empire as closely as Harald had in his final, fateful battle. Just a few weeks after these events, a new era dawned in European history. By the time of Harald's demise in 1066, Viking influence was already deeply rooted in global culture, trade, and historical development, yet it also sowed the seeds of their own decline. Assimilation, their gradual absorption by the peoples and lands they colonized, along with the spreading and unifying force of Christianity, contributed to their decline no less than any single battlefield defeat. In essence, a fundamental shift was occurring in European history. Rus now became Russia, and this land, once home to Vikings, bore the name Rus, indicating their Scandinavian origin. Normandy transformed into the land of the Normans, and the Normans were none other than descendants of the Vikings. Ultimately, it was the Normans who would conquer England, and their legacy in European history is thus vast and multifaceted. As warriors, settlers, explorers, and traders, the Vikings became catalysts for extraordinary social and political transformations, stimulating global economic growth and the strengthening of European states, contributing to the development of national identities, and making significant advancements in shipbuilding, navigation, and many other fields. Their brutal and merciless raids earned the Vikings a lasting reputation as barbarians, but in their relentless pursuit of opportunity, wealth, and control, the Vikings did not destroy Western civilization. Instead, they enriched it, perhaps permanently, leaving an indelible mark.